Hi there, me again. If you guys have been watching my videos for any amount of time now, you'll know that I've been doing a lot of film photography. I've just kind of dove headfirst into that medium for my personal work, and I've been shooting a lot of 35mm and medium format 120 film, and I've gotten to a point where I kind of feel like I've gotten both of those formats under my belt. I've been shooting them both for quite a while now, and I thought it would be a good time to make a video kind of explaining the similarities and differences between the two formats, and to just make a video to kind of help you guys if you're trying to decide between one format or the other, or maybe trying to decide if you want to switch from one format or the other. So let's get into some of the similarities and differences between medium format and 35mm. So I think the number one difference that is the most glaringly obvious when you look at 35mm and medium format is the types of cameras that you have access to. Now, these are both SLRs, and you can tell the medium format SLR design for quite a few different cameras is much different than for 35mm SLRs. But in terms of medium format, I would say you have the most amount of different camera options that you can choose from. In terms of medium format cameras that are pretty commonly found, you can find SLRs, rangefinders, TLRs, view cameras, and folding cameras. And those are all pretty common cameras to find in the medium format world. In terms of 35mm cameras, you're kind of stuck between two main options, and that is the SLR and the rangefinder. And these are both great options, you just don't have quite as many different tools at your disposal when you're looking at 35mm cameras. There are a couple other types of 35mm cameras, like 3D cameras and underwater cameras, but I would consider those really niche items, and they probably aren't going to get used that much for just general purpose photography. So if you want a lot of options of different types of cameras, medium format is probably going to be your way to go. So the next glaringly obvious difference between 35mm and medium format is the difference in aspect ratios. Now, with medium format, once again, you have quite a few more options. There are cameras that shoot 6:45, 6:6, 6:7, 6:8, 6:9, 6:17, and it just gives you a wide array of different aspect ratios to play with, and that's really cool. Now with 35mm cameras, you only really have the 3:2 aspect ratio, and that is found either in a full frame 35mm camera or a half frame 35mm camera. And they're both the same aspect ratio, this just gives you more shots per roll. That leads me perfectly into the next point I want to talk about, which is the differences in shots per roll between 35mm and medium format film. So with medium format, you do have a big variety of different negative sizes that you can work with, but that does come at a cost. Depending on the type of medium format camera and aspect ratio you're shooting with, you could get as many as 15 or as little as 4 shots per roll when shooting medium format. And this is not near as many as when you're shooting 35mm, which is typically rolls of 24 or 36 exposures. Now the reason you might decide to choose medium format and shoot less shots per roll is you will get way more resolution out of your negative. Medium format negatives typically have way better resolution, detail, color rendition, and just overall sharper images than 35mm photos. Now really, I think 35mm negatives have plenty of detail, and you can still end up printing 35mm photos really big, but they just don't have the same look. 35mm is a little bit grainier, and it just kind of has more of what we typically think of as the film look. So really, in terms of resolution, it's a matter of quality versus quantity. So now that we've talked about resolution, we can talk about scanning a little bit. Now, I scan all of my negatives myself, and if you scan all your negatives yourself or you're planning to, this resolution issue could actually decide it for you or be a big thing you want to consider. So typically when I'm scanning 35 millimeter negatives, I'm basically cranking the resolution on my scanner so that I can make sure I'm getting as much quality as I can out of my negatives. And the fact that I am cranking it and the fact that I have more negatives means scanning takes way longer for me with 35 millimeter than it does with medium format. With medium format, I'm not quite as concerned with scanning at the highest resolution available on the scanner, just because there's so much physical data on the negative that I'm really not worried about it, and you end up having plenty of detail even if you're scanning at half the resolution on your scanner. Also, the fact that I'm only scanning about 12 shots on my medium format rolls makes it way faster as well. There are a couple little things that I personally like though about 35 millimeter when I'm scanning, and one is the fact that the 35 millimeter negatives have sprocket holes, so I have something that's very easy to hang on to, and I don't have to worry about getting fingerprints on the actual images themselves, which sounds kind of silly, but it speeds up the workflow and it makes me a little bit less worried and just a little bit more happy when I'm scanning. The next point, just like the last ones, is going to depend entirely on your scanning setup, but with 120 film, I typically run into issues with scanner banding and Newton rings a lot more than I do with 35 millimeter, just because the negatives are a lot bigger and they have a lot more room to sag down and actually touch the glass of the scanner. Printing is another thing that you might want to look into if you're thinking about choosing one or the other, 35 millimeter or medium format. Honestly, you can print medium format negatives really huge and the detail is not going to suffer really. 35 millimeter, honestly though, if you're careful about how you scan and or you get it scanned professionally, you can print those files pretty dang big too. There's a couple YouTubers that I've seen print very big from 35 millimeter negatives, so I'll link those videos down below and you can watch those. Now the next point that I'm about to make is probably one of the more important ones to think about when trying to decide between 35 millimeter and medium format photography, and that is the issue of versatility. So let's pull out my Bronica S2A right here. And this camera system is completely modular. So you've got removable film backs, removable lenses, removable viewfinders, and all of those have interchangeable parts that give you different options. So medium format camera options are very, very versatile, and they just give you a lot of room to experiment and figure out which way of working works the best for you. Now 35 millimeter cameras, like my Canon P here, are not modular at all. Some 35 millimeter cameras are modular, but this one in particular, all you can change is the lens. There's no interchangeable backs, there's no interchangeable viewfinders, so you're basically stuck with the camera itself and the film you choose. So that can be either a limitation or a very freeing capability depending on how you look at it. I will say one of the biggest advantages to the modular camera systems like my Bronica and other medium format camera systems is the interchangeable film backs on a lot of those cameras. That allows you to have a couple different film backs loaded up with different kinds of film, let's say color and black and white, and then you can switch between those at will whenever you feel like it, and you don't have to shoot an entire roll before you get to switch to a new one. So versatility does come at a cost, and that is size and portability. Now as you can see, 35 millimeter cameras are much, much smaller than medium format cameras, and that allows you to be much more run and gun with your photography, plus the fact that you've got more frames per roll gives you more freeing shooting options, so you can do different angles, you can do multiple different exposures of the same shot, etc. Now medium format is larger on every level than 35 millimeter. The film is bigger, The lenses are bigger, the camera bodies are bigger, the viewfinders are bigger. Everything about medium format is bigger, and that's something you're going to want to take into account and think about your shooting style and what you like to shoot when deciding, because medium format, you're going to be lugging around much bigger gear than 35 millimeter. Now that leads me into my final question, which is what types of photographers should be choosing which film formats? Now, I would say if you want to just get started in film photography, you don't have any experience, and maybe you like to shoot more shots and you like the film look that everybody thinks about when they think of film, and you just shoot fast, I think 35 millimeter is the way to go. Photographers that like to shoot things like street photography, maybe cars, just lifestyle things, and snapshots of life events, I think 35 millimeter is going to be much better for you. You can focus things faster, you can work with the camera, and it's not as fiddly of a process. And also, if you're just getting started, 35 millimeter is much cheaper per shot than medium format. Now, if you're a photographer that's a little bit more experienced, or maybe you're a photographer that likes to shoot much slower and more intentionally, and you like to shoot subjects like landscapes or buildings, or things that are far away and need as much detail as possible, I think medium format would be the format for you. Medium format is an inherently slower process because the cameras are a little bit more fiddly, I would say, for the most part. You've got things like dark slides and waist level viewfinders that are not as fast to work with, but you can get some amazing results with those cameras. So I think it just takes the type of workflow that is a little bit slower to get the most out of medium format film. So that's it for my video comparing 35 millimeter and medium format film photography. I hope if you are deciding between these two formats that this video helped you out a little bit. And yeah, I plan to make tons more videos about film photography in the future, so I will see you in the next one. Bye now.